So let's have our other panelists come on up and join us. Muzaffar, if you could come up too. We have some questions that are specific to you. And we have a lot of them here. I'm going to try my best to try to get through as many of these as possible. Unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to be able to get through all of them, but I'll try my best, so I'm going to ask you guys to be as concise as possible. So this first question, Muzaffar, isn't deportation really about economic trends and not if a Democrat or a Republican are in the White House? An example is Reagan amnesty 1986.
Is this on? No. Yeah.
There you
so
go.
I actually cut my teeth in the 86 law, so I know a bit about this. I mean, let me just try to be counterintuitive. I really do not think that the deportation is that much about economics. And the way to talk about this is about Obama. And Obama was actually described by a lot of people as the deporter-in-chief. And in my slide there show we reached the peak of, as if Obama had decided sitting in the White House that I'm going to deport 410,000 people. I don't think that's how it worked. We have forgotten that these things take a long period to fruition. If you really want to know the present genesis of our large deportation, it's the 1996 law. And Congress in 1996, it came in the wake of a big Republican surge, which wrote contract with America. And one of their important elements was to make life very hard for unauthorized people. And in 1996, we essentially wrote in scorched earth policy towards unauthorized people in general and criminal immigrants among them in particular. It just happened that we did not see the effect of the 1996 law till very recently. Because A, Congress put no money. It authorized all those, it put no money. Like the 287G provisions all of you talked about, that was written in law in 1990s. We did not have a single 287G program till 2002. Only after 9/11 did people realize, oh my God, we have something in the law called 287G. And that rose to big numbers in 2006. After that, we had secure communities. Nothing to do with secure communities was the recommendation of the 9/11 Commission because of the 9/11. And after secure communities, the world changed for deportation. It's for the first time we saw an entanglement between our criminal justice system and immigration removal. You know, I started practicing in the 1980s. Before, 1990s, it was almost impossible to find someone within the country to deport them. Inside the country, deportations just did not happen. We used to deport people mostly from the border. And that changed because of secure communities. And I think we now have this profound, formidable machinery of immigration that no matter who the president is, we have a large number of people in the funnel for removal. The only thing that can change is the policies of the president as to, among the people that come to, who is our priority for removal. That's what Obama finally changed. It took him 6 years to do it. But in the last 2 years of the Obama administration, they finally managed to change the priorities. That will still remove 400,000 people. But we have decided that of the 400,000 people, 85% of the people will remove with people with criminal records. So in this administration, those priorities are now off the charts. Almost everyone is a priority. And when everyone is a priority, no one is a priority. And that's what is creating the distrust and the anxiety in our communities.
Very good. This next question's for Kit. Kit, can you explain how states are picked for refugee resettlement? And then also, a second question, Latin America represented a small percentage of refugees. Why are they not given that status and instead feel obligated to cross the border illegally and seek asylum?
Well, to be honest, some of these questions are outside the scope of my responsibility, but I'll try to answer them as best as I can. It's actually not the states that decide how many refugees come to those states. We're consulted, but the ultimate decision is made by the Department of State, specifically the Populations, Refugee, and Migration Bureau. And that decision is done in partnership with 9 national resettlement agencies. Melissa said earlier that she's one of 3. She's got a relationship with one of these 9 national agencies, and that national agency has a network of affiliates across the United States. So it's really the federal government that looks at those numbers versus here as the state. Just in general, we've always been about 2% of the national total in the number of refugees coming in. I like to think about us as medium big, but I will say that one of the things that we look at as a state is how can we do this for the maximum amount of people, but also do it well. So that's something we're always balancing, like all nonprofits are, right? I'm not a nonprofit, but I come from nonprofit, so I think like nonprofit. So how do you balance that? And so I'm happy to say that while we're medium big, we're actually number 1 when we look in terms of employment outcomes, in the terms of the services that we're able to provide refugees that will really kind of get them on that road towards opportunity. And the second question about Latin America, I think it's always good to remember that the refugee resettlement process that we see in the United States is actually a part of an international response to migration. And so when we see policies come down and play out in refugee resettlement, it's really an international decision that's been made. To be a refugee, you have to have fled for a well-founded fear of persecution of 5 different reasons, and then whether or not your refugee is actually, or whether or not you're eligible for refugee resettlement is actually determined by the United Nations High Commission of Refugees. So it's a complicated question. I get what you're asking. I'm sorry that I don't have any more specifics in order to say that it is the international community's decision there.
Okay, very good. Nicole, your turn. So can you speak to how immigration, undocumented people, and refugees impact rural Colorado? Rural Colorado.
Sure. I was just thinking about that as I was preparing for this talk. So one of the things that we see so often is that a lot of the rural population are unauthorized, undocumented folks that are picking onions in southern Colorado, working in mushroom farms as far south as Alamosa, working in the dairy farms in northern Colorado, working in the cornfields on the west slope. We know that our refugee brothers and sisters are working on the west slope to harvest peaches every year, and somehow within even their resettlement process find a way to move back to Denver so they don't disturb their children's school year. So pick in the summer, come back to Denver in the fall, and then start all over again in the spring. We know that these community members are just the lifeblood of so many of the agricultural businesses across the state, and are seeing more and more that folks that employ them are coming forward and saying, my hands are tied. Like, I know a lot of times that some of my workforce is unauthorized, but I need to be able to, have this workforce here. And so really, right now, the discussion is around how do we leverage those voices to our state legislators? How do we lift up those voices at the federal level to continue to have the conversation about the critical role that immigrants and refugees play across the state?
Very good. Nathan, this one's for you. Medicare process. Any way? Okay, let me see. So is there any way to help clients apply for social, this one is kind of fragmented. I'm going to come back to you. Okay. Chief Q, can you address hate crimes or bullying issues against refugees, immigrants, LGBTQ or Jewish communities, and any efforts to reduce the number of incidents?
So we have seen an increase, I don't know the percentage increase, in hate crimes this year to date. We have detectives who specialize in investigating those. That impacts the entire community, not just the specific victims that were targeted. If in fact there were targeted, a lot of times we have what's classified as a hate crime where we have an individual who's not even a part of a protected class who's being targeted. We don't know why. I just think that these suspects are just being ignorant and just doing stuff out of, like I said, sheer ignorance. Again, we reach out to the communities. We want to ensure that they feel safe in reporting to us. We do, like I said, we have people who specialize in that. We work, if we need to discuss it with the federal agencies, we will talk to the FBI about hate crimes. We reach out to our partners in the ADL to see if they're seeing, because they're a wealth of information for us. Mm-hmm. They can do a lot of things that we can't do. So we take them very serious.
Very good. Okay, Nathan, now I'm ready for you. What community resources exist for families living in fear or families with members who have been detained by ICE?
Well, certainly there are. I mean, some of the organizations that you see here, including CERC, Together Colorado, the groups like Remain. There are AILA. There are groups that provide legal resources. There's not enough of that. I mean, I will say it's difficult, and once people go into detention, it's sometimes kind of a black hole to people on the outside. You see, I mean, there are people who protest outside these detention centers, but it's hard to control what's going on the inside. One of the reasons that we did legal training with Remain for attorneys around bond hearings in detention is to try to help people get out of detention on bond where it's possible, to do that. And so we're hoping that resource will increase and help. But it's difficult. People get moved to other facilities, and even keeping track of where people are and in communication with them can be a challenge. And so we really want to try to reduce the number of people that go into detention in the first place, as well as to try to get people out and maintain communications and legal support wherever it can be found.
Thank you. Celesta, let's see. And I'm pretty good at reading this handwriting, I think. Okay, what is the best way to promote productive civil discourse in our local communities?
Excellent question. I actually would refer folks to look into information provided by the American Friends Service Committee. They are a Quaker-based organization that actually has led the sanctuary work here in Colorado, but they've done an extensive amount of work, and they also have trainings available on how to talk about citizenship privilege in relationship to immigrant communities and what it means to be a powerful ally. I think another place coming from, a faith-based organization is looking to, scriptures and moral teachings that tell us to welcome the stranger, right? And looking towards that and seeing what our spirit calls us to, what our faith calls us to, and then acting and asking those questions. In part of our work, we believe in the human dignity of every person and putting that at the center of our communities, and that includes uplifting those who are not receiving the dignity that they deserve, right? And so kind of placing yourself in that perspective, I think, is a great place to start, as well as looking into some of those other resources.
Thank you. Melissa, let's see if you can answer this one. I'm trying to get everybody covered here. So how do undocumented workers pay taxes if they are undocumented?
I'm probably not the best.
Okay, so someone here, as far as that one, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So somebody? Okay.
Either one of us.
Okay.
Yep. So a lot of folks figure out different ways to be able to work, and many times it's just a matter of folks sometimes having to make the difficult decision to just put down any number, and so they don't really know where that SSN may be tied to, and so they're working under another name, another social, and praying and hoping that at some point that they don't get found out. And so that's why we have that surplus in the Social Security system, is because there's thousands thousands of people working, with other forms of ID. The other thing is that the interesting thing about our government is that many people, for many years, undocumented people included, have been allowed to file taxes and to claim their income using an ITIN, a taxpayer identification number, which regulations for that right now are under fire to restructure that. But for many, many years, when we're talking about reform, one of the stipulations from Congress in the past has been people having paid their taxes for the last 4 years. Many of the folks that we work with and know, when we were talking about the possibility of deferred action for parental arrival passing, came with their packets, including the last 10 years of taxes. And so a lot of our community members do work having an ITIN. There are also people who, as families, have a business, and so all of their income is sort of distributed amongst their family members with a small business and sort of a cash-based economy.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything?
Eric, I would add,
Okay.
they also pay sales tax,
Yep.
gas tax,
Yep.
property tax, so they pay those taxes.
Most of those require no ID.
That's correct. And so we have $139.5 million paid by immigrants across our state through many forms of taxes.
Very good. Let's see, Jerome, I'm going to go to you, and then Melissa, I'm going to ask you this other question, and then open it up for the folks. But Jerome, so you talked about the policy and practice in DPS when you answered the safe havens, but how does it compare to other school districts across the state?
It's pretty good.
I think we're ahead of most other districts. I've spoken to many of my colleagues in large districts such as Aurora, Jeffco, Cherry Creek, and offered them all of our materials, and many of them have adopted the processes that we're doing. So I think we're ahead because of the lens that we live under, the microscope, and because I think we have more immigrant students. I can also say that we communicate with the General Counsel's office in LA, San Francisco, New York, Boston, Maryland, Baltimore, Houston, to help each other know what is going on. And so there is dialogue between large urban districts throughout the country so that we're on the same page and we're learning from each other. So that's what I would offer as far as where we are here in the state as well as in the country.
There's another part of the question that said, why do you feel there is confusion about whether schools are safe havens or not?
I don't think that people would naturally assume that undocumented students or students who are not citizens have a constitutional right to an education. I don't think people would understand that. So I think that leads to some of the confusion. And I don't know that most people understand the guidance about safe havens or safe locations. And so I think if people understood those better, then they would understand why we believe that schools are relatively safe. And one of the things that we've done is we've tried to communicate that with our families so that their kids will continue to come to school, because it's so important for society as well as for their families. So we do try to message that to our families and our communities, especially those who are the most vulnerable.
Very good. So Melissa, this last question, or did you have something to add?
Can I add something
Sure.
just quickly?
Yeah.
I think another reason why folks aren't clear about, schools as sensitive areas is because ICE enforcement is happening around our schools. That's something that we've seen happening on the west side of Denver, in Montbello, that we've also heard accounts of happening in Aurora. And so when ICE is practicing enforcement, when parents are dropping off their kids at school, that sends a message to our communities, right, that schools are not safe. That's not because of these resolutions that are really important that our school districts have put forth, but it is something that we have to pay attention to and document, because that is not okay, right? That is something that we could have potentially a legal battleground in the future. So why these things like rapid response teams and allies and folks being trained to document and legally observe those kinds of situations is so crucial and important.
I want to make sure that I get Melissa in as far as just to wrap us up here. But we have nonprofits here in our audience, And how can nonprofits serving the low-income community best serve the refugee community?
That's a great question. So I think we do often have challenges in building alliances with other nonprofits, and largely this is rooted in language capacity. So on our staff, for example, we have 26 languages represented, and we're using interpreters all the time. So I think probably to start reaching out to one of the 3 refugee resettlement agencies and seeing what services might be needed. We are seeing a lot of new things, especially around low-income housing, around mental health issues, around just a whole host of things. So I think reaching out to one of us first, so it's the African Community Center, International Rescue Committee, and Lutheran Family Services are the 3 refugee resettlement agencies. Starting there is probably good. And then I think all of us working together to advocate for the rights of low-income individuals. And I really appreciate whoever asked that, recognizing that refugees coming in do start as low-income folks. They tend to move their way up. So individuals that I resettled 9 years ago are now owning businesses and thriving in many cases. But people do start with entry-level jobs and really in those low-income situations.
Very good. Let's give our panelists a hand. You guys are great.